The cruelest thing about being invisible is that people eventually forget you can still feel pain. My name is Elliot Brooks, and for as long as I could remember, I had been the person nobody wanted to see. I was 22 years old, born in Omega, unable to speak, and living in a house that never truly felt like a home. The small two-story house sat on the edge of a fading neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, where winter winds rattled the windows and old memories lingered longer than warmth. Every morning began the same way. I woke before sunrise, prepared breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, and made sure everything was ready before the rest of the family came downstairs. My father, Gregory Brooks, rarely looked at me. If he did, it was with the same expression someone might give a problem they wished would disappear. My stepmother, Vanessa, acted as though my silence was an inconvenience she had been forced to tolerate. My younger stepbrother, Tyler, had learned from them well. He spoke over me, mocked me when he thought no one was watching, and treated me as though I existed solely to make his life easier. I communicated through a small notebook I carried everywhere. It was worn from years of use, the corners bent and softened. Whenever I wanted to express something, I wrote it down. Most of the time, nobody bothered reading what I wrote. Eventually, I stopped trying as often. Silence became easier than disappointment. On that particular December morning, snow drifted lazily outside the kitchen window. I stood at the sink washing dishes while laughter echoed from the dining room. My family was discussing Tyler's future, college plans, career opportunities, vacations they hoped to take. Nobody asked about my future. Nobody ever did. I glanced toward the table and saw photographs spread across the surface. Pictures of Tyler receiving awards. Pictures of family trips. Pictures from birthdays and holidays. Not a single photo included me. It was as though I had spent my entire life standing just outside the frame. After breakfast, I walked to my part-time job at a small bookstore downtown. The owner, Mrs. Parker, was one of the few people who treated me kindly. She never seemed bothered by my notebook or my silence. Sometimes she even learned simple signs so conversations would be easier. For a few hours each day, among shelves filled with stories, I could almost pretend I belonged somewhere. But that evening, when I returned home, something felt different. The house was unusually quiet. The living room lights were off. Through the crack beneath my father's office door, I saw a thin line of light. As I stepped closer, voices drifted into the hallway. Normally, I would have walked away. Years of experience had taught me that family conversations rarely included me. But then I heard my name. I froze. My father's voice sounded calm. Too calm. Another unfamiliar voice answered him. The words were low and difficult to hear. Curious and uneasy, I moved closer. Papers shuffled. A chair creaked. Then my father spoke again. "He won't cause any trouble," he said. "He never does." A strange chill ran through me. I pressed closer to the wall. The unfamiliar man asked another question. My father laughed softly. "Trust me," he replied. "Nobody's going to miss him." My heart stopped. Every instinct told me something was wrong. Very wrong. I backed away from the door before anyone noticed me listening. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my notebook. My hands trembled. I tried convincing myself I had misunderstood. Maybe they were discussing something else. Maybe it had nothing to do with me. But deep inside, a terrible feeling had already begun to grow. Downstairs, a door opened. Footsteps crossed the hallway. A car engine started outside. I moved to the window and watched an unfamiliar black sedan disappear into the snowy night. Then I noticed the envelope sitting on my desk. It hadn't been there earlier. Slowly, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with legal language I barely understood. But one sentence stood out immediately. My eyes locked onto the words, and all the warmth drained from my body. Without my knowledge, a deal had already been made. I stared at the document until the words blurred together. My hands shook so badly that the paper slipped from my fingers and landed on the floor beside my bed. For several seconds, I could not move. The sentence repeated itself over and over inside my head. A legal transfer agreement. My name. My signature line left blank. The realization settled over me like ice. Whatever arrangement had been made, nobody had expected my permission. I bent down, picked up the paper, and read it again. The language was formal and complicated, but one detail stood out clearly. A date. 2 days from now. Something was scheduled to happen in 48 hours. I grabbed my notebook and quickly wrote a list of questions. What agreement? Who signed it? Where was I going? Why had nobody told me? Clutching both the notebook and the document, I hurried downstairs. Voices drifted from the kitchen. My father sat at the table drinking coffee while Vanessa scrolled through her phone. Tyler leaned against the counter eating a snack. None of them looked surprised when I entered the room. I opened my notebook and shoved it toward my father. He barely glanced at the page. His expression remained calm, almost bored. Then he pushed the notebook back toward me. I wrote another question. Faster this time. My father sighed heavily and folded his arms. You were going to find out eventually, he said. Vanessa looked up from her phone and rolled her eyes. Honestly, Elliot, stop acting dramatic. My chest tightened. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote again. What is this? Tyler laughed before anyone answered. It means somebody finally found a use for you. The words struck harder than I wanted to admit. My father stood and walked toward the window. Snow continued falling outside. You should be grateful, he said without turning around. This arrangement benefits everyone. I stared at him in disbelief. Grateful? The word felt impossible. I scribbled another question. Where am I going? This time Vanessa answered. You do not need to worry about details. She sounded annoyed, as though the conversation itself was inconveniencing her. Everything has already been handled. My hands clenched around the notebook. For years I had accepted being ignored, accepted being overlooked. But this was different. This was my life. I wrote one final sentence. I do not agree. Tyler laughed again. That is funny. Nobody else laughed, but nobody disagreed either. The silence that followed told me everything. My opinion had never been part of the decision. I left the kitchen before they could see the tears gathering in my eyes. Upstairs, I locked my bedroom door and sat on the floor. For the first time in years, anger pushed through the numbness. I wanted answers. Real answers. The next morning, I skipped breakfast and went straight to the bookstore. Mrs. Parker noticed immediately that something was wrong. She offered me a concerned smile. I hesitated before writing a brief explanation in my notebook. Her expression darkened as she read. Elliot, she said gently. Are you sure? I nodded. She looked troubled but did not press further. Later that afternoon, while organizing books in the storage room, my phone vibrated. An unknown number. Normally, I ignored calls from strangers. This time I answered. There was silence for a moment. Then a calm male voice spoke. Elliot Brooks? My pulse quickened. I could not respond, so I remained silent. The caller continued anyway. My name is Victor Kane. I am calling regarding your upcoming transfer. My grip tightened around the phone. I understand you have questions, he said. Unfortunately, I cannot answer all of them. But I can tell you one thing. I held my breath. His next words changed everything. The people acquiring your contract are not who you think they are. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Victor Kane's words echoed through my mind long after the call ended. The people acquiring your contract are not who you think they are. I wanted to call him back. I wanted answers. Instead, every attempt led to the same result. No response. By the time I returned home that evening, a heavy snowstorm had settled over the city. The streets were coated in white, and the freezing wind rattled the bare tree branches outside the house. When I stepped through the front door, I immediately noticed several suitcases lined up against the wall. My stomach dropped. The date on the document was tomorrow. They had already packed my belongings. Or at least the few belongings they believed I deserved to keep. Nobody greeted me. Nobody asked where I had been. My father sat in the living room watching television. Vanessa scrolled through her phone. Tyler laughed at something on his screen. It felt less like a family preparing to say goodbye and more like people waiting for a package to be picked up. I went upstairs and closed my bedroom door. Sleep never came that night. Every sound made my heart race. Every passing car seemed significant. By sunrise, exhaustion weighed heavily on my body. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Then a second one followed. Through the window, I watched several men step out. They wore dark coats and moved with quiet professionalism. No shouting, no intimidation, just calm efficiency. A few moments later, the front doorbell rang. My father answered almost immediately, as if he had been waiting beside the door. I carried my notebook downstairs and stopped at the bottom step. One of the visitors stood in the entryway. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and appeared to be in his late 30s. His expression was composed and unreadable. The moment he saw me, he offered a small nod. Elliot Brooks? He asked. I nodded cautiously. Victor Kane, he said. Recognition hit me instantly. This was the man from the phone call. He glanced briefly toward my family before returning his attention to me. Something about that simple gesture surprised me. He was looking at me, not around me, not through me, at me. He handed me a folder. Inside were documents with my name printed neatly across several pages. I looked up, confused. Victor seemed to understand. Everything inside belongs to you, he explained. Identification records, financial information, and personal documents. My eyes widened. I had never even possessed copies of most of those records. My father had always controlled them. Before I could process that information, another presence entered the room. The atmosphere changed instantly. Every conversation stopped. Even Victor straightened slightly. I turned toward the doorway. The man who stepped inside was unlike anyone I had ever met. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in a tailored black coat that contrasted sharply against the snow falling behind him. Dark hair, gray eyes, calm confidence. The room seemed smaller somehow simply because he occupied it. Tyler lowered his gaze immediately. Vanessa suddenly looked nervous. Even my father appeared uncomfortable. The stranger said nothing at first. His attention settled on me. Not my notebook. Not my condition. Me. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then he spoke. Elliot. His voice was deep but surprisingly gentle. Hearing my name spoken that way felt strange. Almost unfamiliar. I nodded uncertainly. He studied me for another moment before extending a hand. My name is Damen Blackwood. The name hit me like a thunderclap. Even I knew who Damen Blackwood was. Across Ohio and beyond, his name carried enormous influence. Business headlines mentioned him constantly. Rumors surrounded him. Stories circulated about his power, his wealth, and the vast organization he controlled. Every terrifying assumption I had made over the last 2 days suddenly returned at once. My pulse accelerated. Damen seemed to notice. Instead of moving closer, he lowered his hand and took a small step back. The gesture was unexpected, respectful. Then he said something that completely shattered every expectation I had. You do not have to be afraid of me. For a moment, nobody spoke. Snow drifted quietly outside the open doorway while Damen Blackwood stood waiting for my response. The room felt frozen in time. My father avoided looking at either of us. Vanessa stared at the floor. Tyler looked as though he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. I tightened my grip on my notebook and studied the man standing before me. Everything I had heard about Damen painted him as powerful, untouchable, and intimidating. Yet nothing about his behavior matched the image I had built in my head. He was not demanding. He was not rushing me. Most surprisingly, he seemed to understand exactly how overwhelmed I felt. Victor stepped forward and quietly handed me a pen. I opened my notebook and wrote a simple question. Why me? Damen read the words carefully. Instead of answering immediately, he glanced toward the rest of the room. That conversation can wait until you are somewhere comfortable, he said. Then he looked back at me. For now, you have a choice. You can come with us, or you can stay here. The answer should have been obvious. Yet hearing someone actually offer me a choice felt so unfamiliar that I almost did not know how to respond. My entire life had been shaped by decisions made for me. Schools chosen for me. Jobs chosen for me. Rules imposed on me. Even this transfer had happened without my permission. And now, suddenly, someone was asking what I wanted. I looked around the room one final time. At the house. At the family that had never truly felt like mine. Then I closed the notebook and nodded. Damen gave a single respectful nod in return. Less than 30 minutes later, I found myself sitting in the back of a black SUV as the city disappeared behind us. Nobody pressured me into conversation. Victor sat in the front passenger seat reviewing documents while Damen occupied the seat across from me. Most of the drive passed in silence. Strangely, it was the most comfortable silence I had experienced in years. Nearly 2 hours later, the vehicle turned through a set of private gates. My eyes widened as the estate came into view. It was enormous. The main residence sat atop a gentle hill surrounded by snow-covered pines. Warm lights glowed through tall windows. Despite its size, the property did not feel cold or intimidating. It felt peaceful. The SUV stopped beneath a covered entrance. Before I could reach for my suitcase, one of the staff members politely offered assistance. Another greeted me with a smile. No one stared. No one looked uncomfortable because of my silence. Inside, the house was warm and inviting. Dark wood floors stretched beneath elegant lighting. Large bookshelves lined several walls. A stone fireplace crackled softly in the distance. I expected someone to show me to a guest room. Instead, Damien personally led me upstairs. When he opened the door, I froze. The room was larger than my entire bedroom back home. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the snowy forest. Bookshelves stood along one wall. A desk sat near the window. Fresh clothes had already been arranged neatly inside an adjoining closet. I turned toward Damien, unable to hide my confusion. He seemed to anticipate the question. "This room is yours," he said simply. "Yours. Not temporary. Not assigned. Yours." The word felt unreal. After he left, I spent nearly an hour exploring the room. For the first time in my life, I had privacy. Instead, I found Damien seated at a smaller table near the fireplace. Only 2 place settings had been prepared. As I sat down, I noticed something resting beside my plate. It was a book. My heart skipped. American Sign Language. Beginner and Advanced Communication Guide. Confused, I looked up. Damien calmly lifted one hand. Then, in careful, deliberate movements, he signed a short sentence. It was not perfect. It was not fluent. My mind struggled to process what had just happened. Nobody had ever taken the time to learn sign language for me. Not my father. Not Vanessa. Not Tyler. His signs were careful and deliberate, showing that he was still learning. I responded instinctively, correcting one of his hand positions. To my surprise, he laughed softly and repeated the sign correctly. It was such a simple moment, but it felt strangely normal. For the first time in years, communication did not feel like a struggle. Dinner passed quietly. We exchanged simple signs and occasionally used a notepad when something became too complicated. I learned that several staff members were also studying sign language. Damien had arranged lessons months earlier. That detail lingered in my thoughts long after dinner ended. Months earlier, before he had ever met me. The next few days passed unlike anything I had experienced before. Every morning, breakfast appeared exactly how I liked it. Fresh fruit, oatmeal, and tea. Someone had somehow learned my preferences. The library became my favorite room in the house. Hundreds of books filled the shelves from floor to ceiling. I spent hours reading beside large windows overlooking the snow-covered forest. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody demanded anything from me. One afternoon, I found Victor organizing paperwork in a home office. Curiosity finally overcame my hesitation. I opened my notebook and wrote a question. "How long have you known about me?" Victor read it carefully. His expression became thoughtful. After a moment, he closed the folder he had been reviewing and leaned back in his chair. "Longer than you might think," he admitted. My heart skipped. I quickly wrote another question. "Why?" Victor remained silent for several seconds. Then he stood and walked to a locked cabinet. When he returned, he placed a thick file on the desk between us. My name was printed across the front. I stared at it in disbelief. Victor opened the file. Inside were school records, medical records, employment records, photographs, notes, years of information. "Mr. Blackwood began investigating your situation almost 4 years ago," Victor explained quietly. I looked up sharply. "For years? That was impossible." Victor nodded as though he understood my reaction. "There were concerns about your living conditions," he continued. "At first, the investigation was routine. Then certain patterns emerged." My hands trembled as I turned another page. Every major event of my life seemed documented. Not in a controlling way. In a protective way. Someone had been watching to ensure I was safe. Someone had been paying attention when nobody else did. I looked at Victor, desperate for answers. "Mr. Blackwood never intended to own you," he said firmly. "That was never the objective." He pointed toward the file. "His goal was to make certain you had a future." I lowered my gaze to the pages spread before me. For years, I had believed nobody noticed my existence. Nobody cared enough to look beyond the surface. Yet hidden within that file was proof that someone had been paying attention all along. Then Victor revealed one final detail. "There is something else you should know," he said. "The reason Mr. Blackwood became involved in the first place is because he knew someone very important who reminded him of you." The revelation stayed with me long after I left Victor's office. That evening, I wandered through the library unable to focus on the pages in front of me. "Someone important who reminded him of you." The sentence repeated endlessly in my mind. I wanted answers, yet part of me was afraid to ask. Over the following week, life settled into a rhythm that still felt unreal. Every morning, I joined Damien for breakfast. Some conversations happened through sign language. Others happened through notes written on a tablet he kept nearby. His signing improved quickly. Sometimes he practiced new phrases before meals, and whenever he made mistakes, he accepted corrections without embarrassment. The effort meant more to me than I could explain. One snowy afternoon, I sat near the fireplace reading while Damien worked across the room. Silence filled the space comfortably. Not the lonely silence I had known for most of my life, but a peaceful one. At some point, I looked up and realized he was watching me. When our eyes met, he immediately returned to his paperwork, though a faint smile appeared on his face. It was such a small moment, yet warmth spread through my chest. For years, I had lived as though my existence burdened everyone around me. Here, I never felt like a burden. A few days later, Damien invited me to accompany him into town. Nervous but curious, I agreed. We visited a small bookstore first. The owner greeted Damien warmly before introducing herself to me. She spoke directly to me, not through him. Later, we stopped at a cafe overlooking a frozen lake. As snow drifted outside the windows, I watched families laugh together over hot chocolate and coffee. Normally, scenes like that made me feel strangely distant. This time felt different. For the first time, I felt included in the world around me. On the drive home, I finally gathered enough courage to ask the question that had been haunting me. Using my tablet, I typed a simple message and showed it to Damien. Who reminded you of me? His expression changed instantly. Not sadness exactly, something deeper. For several seconds, he stared out the window at the passing trees. Then he slowly signed his response. My younger brother. I froze. Damien continued signing carefully. His brother had also been unable to speak. Growing up, he had often struggled to be understood by others. Damien had spent years learning how to communicate with him. They had been very close. As he signed, I noticed something I had never seen before. Vulnerability. The powerful man everyone feared suddenly looked like someone carrying an old memory. What happened to him? I asked gently. Damien lowered his gaze. For a moment, I thought he might refuse to answer. Instead, he reached into his wallet and removed a small photograph. He handed it to me. The picture showed two young boys standing beside a lake. One was clearly a younger Damien. The other smiled brightly at the camera. Even through the faded image, the resemblance between the brothers was obvious. I stared at the photograph before looking back at him. Damien's next words were quiet. He signed them slowly. I could not protect him when he needed me. The confession hung between us. Suddenly, so many things made sense. The sign language lessons. The investigation. The care he showed me. This had never been about obligation. It had started with loss. Before I could respond, Damien's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth in his expression vanished. A moment later, he looked directly at me and signed 5 words that made my stomach drop. Your family is looking for you. The drive back to the estate felt much longer than before. I sat quietly beside Damien, replaying his words again and again. Your family is looking for you. Weeks earlier, hearing that news might have filled me with hope. Now it filled me with dread. Nothing about their sudden interest felt genuine. Not after everything that had happened. When we arrived home, Victor was already waiting inside the study. Several folders sat open across the desk. The atmosphere was calm, but I could sense tension beneath the surface. Damien motioned for me to sit beside him. Victor handed over a tablet displaying a series of photographs and reports. At first, I did not understand what I was seeing. Then recognition hit me. My father, Vanessa, Tyler. Recent photographs showed them speaking with reporters outside local businesses. In another image, Tyler appeared to be posting videos online. Confused, I looked toward Victor. He immediately explained. They have been telling people that you disappeared without warning, he said carefully. They claim they are worried about your safety. My stomach twisted. Worried. The word felt absurd. Victor opened another file. This one contained screenshots of fundraising pages, interviews, and social media posts. The more I read, the worse it became. My family was presenting themselves as victims. They described themselves as heartbroken relatives searching for a missing loved one. Some people had already begun supporting them. Donations were arriving. Public sympathy was growing. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Damien remained silent beside me. His jaw tightened slightly, but otherwise he showed little reaction. I opened my notebook and wrote a single question. Why now? Victor exchanged a brief glance with Damien before answering. Because people have started noticing where you are. The realization hit immediately. Over the past few weeks, I had accompanied Damien to bookstores, cafes, and charity events. Nothing dramatic. Nothing publicized. But photographs existed. People had seen us together. Word traveled quickly when someone like Damen Blackwood appeared in public. My family had learned that I was no longer isolated, no longer invisible, no longer dependent on them. And suddenly they wanted me back. Anger rose inside me, surprising even myself. Not because they were searching for me, because they were pretending to care. Damen noticed the expression on my face. Without speaking, he reached over and placed a folder in front of me. Inside were legal documents, financial records, and copies of agreements connected to my transfer. Everything had been preserved. Every signature, every communication, every detail, evidence, proof. Nothing could be rewritten. Nothing could be hidden. You are protected, Victor said. No matter what story they tell publicly. For the first time since leaving home, I felt something I had not expected. Relief. Real relief. Later that evening, I sat alone in the library watching snow fall beyond the windows. The estate felt peaceful as always, yet my thoughts remained restless. A quiet knock interrupted my reflection. Damen stepped inside, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He handed one to me before taking the chair across from mine. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then I picked up my notebook and wrote a question. What happens now? Damen read the page carefully. His response came through sign language. Slow, deliberate, certain. You do not face them alone. The words settled deep inside my chest. All my life, every challenge had been mine to endure by myself. Every disappointment, every rejection, every lonely moment. Yet here sat someone promising the exact opposite. Before I could respond, Victor appeared in the doorway. His expression was serious. Mr. Blackwood, he said quietly, they have formally requested a meeting. Silence filled the room. I looked from Victor to Damen. Damen's eyes never left mine as he signed 6 words that changed everything. This time, we tell the truth. 3 days later, the meeting took place in a private conference room inside one of Damen's corporate buildings in downtown Columbus. Snow covered the streets outside, but inside the building, everything felt controlled and calm. I sat beside Damen at a long polished table while Victor organized documents across from us. My hands rested on my notebook, though I barely looked at it. The anxiety twisting inside my stomach had followed me all morning. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doors opened. Gregory Brooks entered first. Vanessa followed behind him, dressed elegantly as though she were attending a social event instead of a family meeting. Tyler came last. The moment I saw them, memories rushed back. Years of silence. Years of feeling invisible. For a brief second, I wondered if I would freeze the way I always had before. But something was different now. I was not alone. My father immediately attempted a sympathetic expression. Elliot, he said, as though we had been separated by some terrible misunderstanding. We have been worried sick. The words felt hollow. Damen remained silent. Victor simply made a note on his tablet. Vanessa clasped her hands dramatically. We only want our family back together. Tyler nodded in agreement. If I had not known the truth, their performance might have been convincing. For several minutes, they continued speaking. They described themselves as concerned parents. They spoke about love, sacrifice, and family values. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Finally, Damen leaned back in his chair. His voice was calm when he spoke. Are you finished? The room fell silent. My father frowned. Excuse me. Damen nodded toward Victor. Without a word, Victor activated a large monitor mounted on the wall. Instantly, documents appeared across the screen. Legal agreements, financial records, email exchanges, transaction histories. Every record connected to the arrangement that had transferred me from their control. The color drained from Vanessa's face. Tyler looked confused at first, then nervous. My father's expression hardened. Victor calmly walked through the timeline. Dates, signatures, correspondence. Every detail was documented. There was no room for interpretation, no room for denial. The truth spoke for itself. These records confirm, Victor said evenly, that Elliot's transfer was negotiated voluntarily by his legal guardians. No concerns for his welfare were expressed before, during, or after the agreement. Silence filled the room. My father opened his mouth to argue, but quickly stopped. Another document appeared, then another. Records showing that none of them had attempted to contact me until after photographs of me with Damen became public. The timeline was impossible to dispute. Vanessa's carefully maintained composure began to crack. This is not what it looks like, she insisted. Victor simply displayed another email. Then another. My pulse pounded as I watched years of assumptions collapse around them. For once, nobody was ignoring the truth. Nobody was looking away. Eventually, Damien turned toward me. His expression remained calm, patient. He signed a simple question. Would you like to say something? Every eye in the room shifted toward me. In the past, that attention would have terrified me. Today felt different. Slowly, I opened my notebook. Then I paused. Instead of writing, I lifted my hands. Damien understood immediately. So did Victor. Using sign language, I spoke for myself. Damien translated aloud only when necessary. I explained how invisible I had felt, how often my voice had been dismissed before it could even exist. I described years of loneliness without accusation or anger, just honesty. By the time I finished, nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. The silence that followed felt completely different from the silence I had known growing up. This silence carried understanding. Then my father finally spoke. Elliot, he said quietly, please come home. For a moment, the room stood perfectly still. Then I looked toward Damien, toward Victor, toward the people who had chosen to see me when nobody else had. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where home was. I looked at my father for a long moment before lowering my hands. The answer had already formed in my heart long before that meeting began. Home was not a place. It was not a building. It was not a name written on legal documents. Home was where you felt seen, where you felt safe, where you felt valued. And for the first time in my life, I understood that difference. Slowly, I shook my head. The disappointment that crossed Gregory's face was immediate. Vanessa looked away. Tyler stared down at the table. None of them argued. Perhaps because, for once, there was nothing left to say. The truth had already spoken. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As Damien and I left the building together, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The weight I had carried for years felt lighter. Not because my past had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled my future. Outside, snow drifted softly across the city streets. The world looked clean and bright beneath the winter sky. During the drive back to the estate, neither Damien nor I spoke much. The silence between us felt comfortable, familiar. At one point, I looked out the window and realized I was smiling. It was a small smile, but a genuine one. Damien noticed. He did not comment. He simply smiled back. The following weeks brought changes I never expected. The public narrative surrounding my family faded quickly once the facts became known. Donations stopped. Interviews disappeared. People moved on to other stories. Meanwhile, I focused on building a life of my own. Damien encouraged me to return to school if I wanted. He helped me explore opportunities one had never believed were possible. Eventually, I enrolled in a program focused on literature and communication. Books had always been my refuge. Now they became the foundation of my future. Life at the estate continued to feel almost unreal. Mornings began with breakfast beside the fireplace. Afternoons were often spent studying in the library. Some evenings, Damien and I walked through the snow-covered trails surrounding the property. Sometimes we talked through sign language. Other times we simply enjoyed the quiet. Little by little, the loneliness that had defined so much of my life began to disappear. One evening in early spring, nearly 6 months after leaving my old house, I discovered something tucked inside a drawer in the library. It was an old photograph. Damien and his younger brother stood beside a lake beneath a bright summer sky. I studied the picture for several moments before Damien entered the room. When he saw what I was holding, his expression softened. Carefully, I handed the photograph back to him. Then I signed a simple sentence. He would be proud of you. Damien looked down at the picture before meeting my gaze. For a brief moment, emotion flickered across his face. Then he signed something I would never forget. I think he would be proud of both of us. Months later, on the first snowfall of the following winter, I stood beside one of the large windows overlooking the forest. The estate glowed warmly behind me. Laughter drifted from the kitchen where staff members were preparing dinner. Somewhere upstairs, music played softly. The house felt alive. It felt like family. Damien joined me at the window and stood quietly at my side. Outside, snowflakes floated gently through the evening air. I turned toward him and raised my hands. Thank you for finding me. The words felt too small for everything I wanted to express, but they were honest. Damien watched the signs carefully. Then he answered in the same language that had changed my life. I was not the one who found you, Elliot. You found your way here. We stood together watching the snowfall in comfortable silence. Years earlier, I had believed my voice did not matter because it could not be heard. I had spent so much of my life feeling invisible that I forgot one important truth. Being understood has never depended on speaking. Sometimes it depends on someone choosing to listen. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.